The mine foreman's office was sparse and cold, a structure of unpainted wood and a tin stove that had long since given up its heat, and Thea Lindgren stood before the desk with her hands clasped at her waist and Emil pressed against her legs like a small animal sensing danger. And the foreman, a thick-necked man named Kruger, with copper-colored sideburns and the permanent scowl of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, slid an envelope across the desk without meeting her eyes and said the cabin would be needed for the next shift supervisor, that the company could not hold it for a widow woman, that this was her husband's final pay from the mine, $4.20, for the work of 8 years, breaking silver ore from the earth, 8 years of descending into darkness and returning with the silver dust in his lungs like a second language, and 8 years of her waiting for him to come up, waiting for the sound of the heavy boots on the wooden platforms, waiting for the bell that meant the men had reached the surface alive. The envelope felt impossibly light in her hand, lighter than paper, as though money itself had lost meaning in the space between the desk and her palm. And she thought of the way light seemed to have weight and presence in the mountain valleys of this new country, pressing down on everything with the mass of something that could not be escaped. And the foreman was already turning back to his ledger, his pink fingers reaching for the pen, the gesture of a man erasing people from his thoughts before they had even left the room, before her presence had become a complication in the accounting of his day. She turned and walked out into the cold of Galena, that ramshackle collection of cabins and corrals, and the mouth of the Glenfiddich mine that had become her home. And then, in the time it took for a man to fall 500 feet down a shaft, ceased to be her home at all. And Emil was asking if they could go back to see the mine, if his father was still down there in the dark, if they should call to him. And she did not answer, because there was no answer that a child could understand. There was no language she possessed that could explain the mathematics of falling, the terrible arithmetic of grief, and the streets of the town seemed narrower now than they had before, as though the buildings had pressed inward in the days since Lars had died, and the people who had been friendly now looked away when she passed, and the wives of the miners who had once borrowed her needlework no longer came to her door. The sky above Galena was a flat gray color, the same gray as the limestone of the mine entrance, the same gray as the winter that was coming down out of the north, and the wind moved through the town in a way that seemed to carry a message, seemed to be saying something about laws, and the impermanence of all human structures built against the mountains. They walked to the general store and sold the contents of their cabin, a bed frame, a table, 2 chairs, Emil's crib that he no longer used, but that she had kept as though it might somehow summon his infancy back into being, a small painted dresser that had held her linens and her few precious things, to the proprietor, a man named Haight, who gave her $30 for goods that had cost twice that sum, and she did not argue because the money was needed, and because arguing was a luxury for people who had options, and because she understood that the proprietor was not acting from malice, but from the simple mathematics of commerce, the way that a dying thing loses its value, not because it has changed, but because the world has changed in relation to it. She watched the man place her crib into a storage room, and she thought of Emil as an infant, small enough to fit in her 2 hands, and she wondered where that child had gone, and where this boy had come from, the one whose head now reached her waist, whose questions were becoming harder, and whose need for his father was becoming deeper, even as the distance from his father grew more absolute with each passing day. She bought a sled, a sturdy thing made of ash wood with runners of polished iron that had been pulled across 1,000 miles of snow, and a cast iron pot, a small camp stovepipe of tin salvaged from some piece of mining equipment, a bag of flour that weighed 20 pounds, a tin of lard with the maker's stamp still visible on the lid, salt in a paper sack, a kerosene storm lantern with a glass chimney that she carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent breakage, matches in a glass jar with a rubber seal, a hand saw with a wooden handle that was smooth from the grip of many hands before her and from her own earnings, money she had set aside coin by coin for mending work for the miners' wives, the piecework that paid almost nothing but that she had done every evening while Emile slept and while she thought of her father. She withdrew the leather satchel that held her father's tools, implements of survival gathered over a lifetime in the snow country of northern Sweden, where winter was not a season but a condition of existence, where a man learned to read the snow as another man might read scripture, where the ability to build shelter from compacted snow was the difference between a grandson and an empty cradle, where knowledge passed from hand to hand and generation to generation like a form of prayer. The tools were few and precious, a curved snow knife forged by a blacksmith in Skellefteå who had shaped it over 3 days, working the metal until it had the flexibility of a willow branch and the edge of a razor, a needle of polished bone carved from the femur of a reindeer, cordage made from sinew that was stronger than hemp twine and lighter than thread, a small wooden measure marked with notches that her father had made himself to calculate snow density, and in their weight and shape the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years in the Arctic, the knowledge that had allowed her father and all the fathers before him to build shelter in a place where trees did not grow and rock was buried under ice, to create home from the very substance of the winter itself. Emile carried his carved wooden moose, a toy her husband had made from pine, with a knife that he had stolen from the mining company and had kept hidden for 10 years, carving at it in the evenings with the patience he showed toward nothing else, and the moose had become a thing of surprising detail. Ribs visible beneath the coat, eyes rendered in 2 small dots of ink, antlers that branched like the twigs of a birch tree, and they set out from Galena in the late afternoon, with the sled tracking behind them, and the weight of the world pressing down, in the form of sky and stone, and the indifferent whiteness of the approaching winter. And Thea did not look back at the town, because she understood that to look back was to acknowledge the reality of what she was leaving behind, and she had learned that survival required a kind of willful amnesia, a capacity to treat the past as though it had happened to someone else. The trail out of the mining town descended through stands of aspen and lodgepole pine, and the snow lay upon everything in a blanket of such undisturbed purity that it seemed sacrilege to walk upon it, to break its surface with their boots and the runners of the sled. But walk they did, moving into the silence of the high valley where the mountains rose on all sides like the walls of some vast cathedral dedicated to cold and emptiness and the triumph of stone over flesh. And Thea felt the weight of the sled behind her, felt the way it resisted the snow, felt the pull of it in her shoulders and her lower back. And this weight seemed to her a good thing, seemed to anchor her to the earth, seemed to be a physical manifestation of the burden that she now carried, the weight of her son's survival and her own, the weight of decisions made and choices left behind. They walked for 3 days, making camps each night in the lee of an outcropping or beneath the bough of a massive spruce tree whose branches hung so low that they created a natural shelter, and Thea built small fires of pine boughs and scraps of dry wood, arranging them in a way that maximized heat and minimized smoke. And Emil huddled beneath the blankets and asked questions that she answered in the soft Swedish of her childhood, the language that seemed to belong to a different woman in a different country, a woman who had known her mother and her siblings and had not yet learned the terrible vocabulary of loss. And she told him stories of the reindeer and the mountains where her father had taken her as a girl, walking through snow that came to her waist, learning to feel the density of it beneath her hands by pressing her palms into it, learning to read its memory in the way its crystals caught light, understanding that snow was not a single thing, but a vast accumulated history of weather and temperature and the passage of time, and that to read the snow was to read the story of the sky itself. On the second night, a wolf called from somewhere in the darkness beyond their fire, and Emil moved closer to his mother and did not speak, understanding without being told that some sounds did not require response, that the world contained forces that were indifferent to human life, and that sometimes the only appropriate response to such forces was silence and stillness. And Thea sat with her back against the tree and held him and thought of her husband and the way he had looked when he was angry, which was rarely, but when it happened, the whole of his face seemed to darken as though a cloud had passed across it, and she had never understood what made men angry or why they allowed rage to live in them like a predator, feeding and growing and shaping itself to the landscape of their days, and she understood only that she would not make the same mistakes that he had made, that she would not squander her energy on emotions that were useless in the face of the mountain and the snow, that her only job now was to keep her son alive, to feed him and shelter him and teach him the things that the mountains themselves would teach if she had the wisdom to listen. The third day they crested a ridge, and the Sawtooth Valley spread below them in all directions, mountains within mountains, peaks that cut at the sky like the teeth of some immense jaw, and the snow lay upon everything to a depth she could scarcely comprehend, 20 feet or more in some of the upper passes, and the sunlight caught the snow crystals and turned them into a landscape of diamonds, brilliant and hard and completely indifferent to human need, and she understood at once that this was where they would stay, that the snow itself had become shelter and sanctuary, and that the knowledge her father had given her was not a luxury, but a necessity, not an ornament of culture, but the thing that stood between her son and death, the thing that made the difference between Emil growing into a man or Emil becoming one more burial mound beneath the endless white, and she felt a kind of gratitude then, a kind of blessing, for the way that her father had insisted on teaching her these things, even though she had resisted, had found them boring, had wanted instead to read books and talk to boys and embrace all the things that her mother had forbidden as unladylike. They descended the ridge slowly, testing the snow beneath them, and Thea moved along the north-facing slope, studying the contours of the land with the careful attention of an architect surveying a site, feeling the snow with the flat of her hand, pressing her fist into it and feeling the resistance, the density, the way it held its shape without crumbling. This was the snow that had been compacted by the weight of winter after winter, the snow that had fallen in the previous year and the year before that, accumulating in layers that recorded the history of the seasons. The way tree rings record time, snow that had turned to ice at its base but remained granular and workable at the surface, snow that could be cut and shaped and stacked and would hold together in a way that no other snow would, snow that would not shift or subside or collapse beneath a load, snow that was dense enough to be architecture and light enough to be insulation. They found their place in the late afternoon, a north-facing hill covered in spruce and pine, where the snowpack lay deeper than the surrounding valleys, where the wind had sculpted and compressed it into a uniform mass that stretched for 100 yards along the slope. And here, in this place of absolute silence and absolute cold, she and Emil would build their home, and Thea felt something shift within her, felt a kind of settling, as though her body had been waiting for this moment without her knowing it. The first day, Thea cut blocks of snow with the curved knife, working with a rhythm that seemed to come not from her conscious mind, but from her hands, from the accumulated knowledge that her muscles carried like a form of memory, knowledge passed down through her body from her father's hands. And Emil worked beside her, dragging the blocks, each one weighing perhaps 80 pounds, and stacking them according to her murmured instructions, understanding without explanation that his mother knew what she was doing, that this was not a game or a desperate improvisation, but a process governed by laws as real as gravity. And by nightfall, they had completed the walls of the main chamber, 8 feet long and 6 feet high and 12 feet wide, with an arched ceiling that she had carved by hand, working the snow knife in smooth practice strokes that removed strips the thickness of her thumb, smoothing the blocks where they met, and packing the seams with snow that she dampened slightly, with water from melted snow, and then allowed to refreeze in the bitter night air, creating a bond that was stronger than the snow itself, that was almost like stone, almost permanent. And the chamber rose from the hillside like some ancient thing, like a burial mound or a monument to the dead, built not by hand alone but by intention. When they entered it for the first time in the darkness, their kerosene lantern held before them, the light spreading across the white walls in a way that seemed to transform the space into something almost otherworldly. The smell of the snow was clean and mineral and faintly sweet, like the smell of ice melting in spring, and the silence was so absolute that it seemed to have substance, to press upon their ears like the absence of sound itself, like the antithesis of all the noise they had left behind in Galena, the thunder of the mining equipment, the calls of the men, the barking of dogs, the wind against wooden structures that could not withstand it. And here, inside the snow, the sound of their breathing was audible. The sound of their hearts beating could almost be heard. And this privacy, this complete separation from the world of men and their chaos, seemed to Thea like the greatest luxury imaginable, more valuable than money, more necessary than food. They lay that first night on a platform of snow that she had left in place at one end of the chamber, a raised bed carved directly from the floor of the shelter, covering it with elk hides that still carried the smell of the animal they had come from, and blankets that she had wrapped in cloth before packing them into the sled. And Emil asked if they were under the ground, if they were like the miners, like his father, and she said no, they were inside the snow, they were protected by it. It was like living inside a cloud that had fallen to earth and become solid, like being held inside the hand of winter itself. And Emil seemed to accept this explanation in the way that children accept the explanations of their mothers, as facts beyond question. And he drifted towards sleep, while the lantern burned amber against the white walls and cast shadows that seemed to move and breathe with a life of their own. Shadows that danced and shifted as though the walls themselves were alive, as though the snow had become something more than snow, something sentient and protective. Over the next 2 weeks, Thea worked with a methodical precision that seemed to acknowledge no fatigue, no hunger beyond what she could suppress, no feeling beyond the primary sensation of cold and the secondary sensation of purpose, working from dawn until the light left the sky. And she carved the storage tunnel that ran perpendicular from the main chamber, 8 feet long and 4 feet wide and high enough to crawl through, using the snow knife with the kind of economy of motion that came from years of practice. And she lined its walls with shelving that she cut directly from the snow itself. Precise parallel lines running the length of the tunnel walls, creating niches where she could store the things they would need: flour and salt and lard, the dried elk jerky that she was beginning to accumulate through her hunting, the fuel that would be essential when the deepest cold came, and when the flames in the hearth would be the only thing standing between them and temperatures that no human body could survive. The things that stood between sustenance and starvation, between a breathing child and a frozen monument. She worked in silence except for the occasional instruction to Emil, and the work seemed almost meditative, as though the act of carving the snow was a form of prayer, a way of communing with the mountain and the winter itself. And the snow knife sang against the compacted ice, a sound both sharp and muffled, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. And each night she would examine her hands by the lantern light and see the snow embedded beneath her fingernails, snow that had frozen into her skin, and she would understand that she was becoming part of this place, that her body was accepting the mountain's terms, that she was no longer separate from the winter, but increasingly woven into its substance. And this transformation did not frighten her, because she had seen it happen to her father, had watched the mountains remake him into something other than purely human, something aligned with stone and snow and the ancient rhythms that moved beneath the surface of the visible world. She built the cooking alcove off the far end of the main chamber, a small space perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet, carved from the snow and then reinforced at its base with a layer of stones that she laid directly on the snow floor, creating a foundation that would hold the weight of the hearth and the fire that would burn within it. And in this space, she constructed a stone hearth using rocks that she and Emil carried up the hillside from the creek bottom. Rocks that had been worn smooth by water and time, fitting them together without mortar, relying on the physics of stone and gravity to hold them in place. And above the hearth, she vented a chimney made from the tin stovepipe that had come from her husband's mining days, tin that still bore the dents and marks of its previous use, running it up through the snow ceiling and out the top of the chamber in a configuration that drew smoke away from the living space while trapping the heat that wanted to rise and dissipate into the atmosphere. And she tested this configuration carefully, building small fires and observing the way the smoke moved, adjusting the angle of the pipe until the draft was perfect, until the heat radiated from the hearth into the space rather than escaping through the ceiling. The first fire she lit in the hearth burned too hot and fast, wasting precious fuel, and she watched it with an intensity that might have seemed obsessive to anyone who did not understand the mathematics of survival, the way that every piece of firewood was a transaction with winter, A small death traded against the larger death that lurked at the edges of warmth, and she made adjustments to the design, building a heat reflector from stones placed behind the hearth, angling it at precisely the right degree to direct warmth back into the chamber rather than allowing it to waste itself against the snow walls, and the difference was immediate and dramatic. The interior temperature rose noticeably as the heat bounced back into the space. She carved a second sleeping niche off the main chamber for a meal, smaller and more intimate than her own space, lined it with the softest furs from the rabbits she had been hunting and the warmest blankets, and she hung a piece of cloth at its entrance so that her son could have the dignity of his own private space, even within their confined world, even in this place where the walls around them were 3 feet thick and the boundary between inside and outside was a matter of a few feet of packed snow and the absolute imperative of heat and survival. And she understood that these small gestures toward privacy and dignity were not luxuries, but were essential to the interior life, essential to maintaining the sense that they were not prisoners in a tomb, but inhabitants of a home. The floor of the main chamber she insulated with layers of pine boughs gathered from the tree line below, their fragrance mixing with the mineral smell of the snow and creating an olfactory landscape that would become the smell of home. And over the pine boughs she laid elk hides and then blankets, creating a surface that was no longer the cold of snow, but something approximating the warmth of earth. And at night, the temperature inside the chamber would hold steady at 32 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, paradoxically warmer inside the snow than in the open air outside, warmer than the cabins in Galena that she had known, warmer than any shelter that the miners' wives had ever complained about in her hearing. In the 3rd week, Thea began the work of supply and storage that would occupy her thoughts and her hands throughout the remaining weeks before the true deep winter, and she set snares for rabbits in the stands of willow near the creek, using techniques that her father had taught her when she was not much older than Emil, techniques that involved understanding the way that fear moved through the bodies of animals, the way that a rabbit would choose a particular route through the snow based on the invisible mathematics of survival. And the rabbits came in abundance, white-furred and fat, living in a food abundance that would not last once the snow deepened, and she killed them with respect and without sentimentality, and smoked their meat over the hearth in the cooking alcove, hanging them from cordage suspended from the snow ceiling, and their pelts she scraped and dried against the snow walls until they were supple enough to fold and store. And Emil would watch her work and ask why the rabbits had to die, his small face troubled by the logic of the world that his mother was teaching him, and she would tell him that death was part of the world, that animals ate animals and all things returned to the earth, that death was not separate from life, but was instead the conversation that life had with itself, and that the difference between a mother and a woman who let her child starve was the willingness to take what the world offered, even when it came with blood on her hands, even when her hands shook with the weight of the killing. She cut holes through the ice of the creek and set lines through the nights, pulling up small trout that she cleaned with the precision of a surgeon, removing the organs and hanging the cleaned fish from wooden frames that she had constructed for this purpose, and the work was repetitive and meditative, and gave her a kind of peace that she had not known since the death of her husband, the peace that comes from engaging in the ancient dialogue between a human being and the land, the dialogue that predates language and commerce and all the complications that men bring to the world. And she understood that in these hours of work, in these moments of complete absorption, in the task of ensuring survival, she was touching something that was older than her own life, older than her father's life, something that reached back through centuries of women in snow country, women who had done these same motions, who had killed these same animals, who had built these same shelters. And in touching this continuity, she felt less alone, felt the presence of all those women standing beside her in the cooking alcove, their hands guiding her hands. A trapper passed through the valley in early November, a man with beaver pelts stacked on a pack horse, moving south toward lower elevations before the passes closed, and Thea traded 2 rabbit pelts and a piece of smoked trout for a sack of flour and a tin of honey, and the trapper looked at her snow tunnel with an expression that combined amazement and skepticism in equal measure, and he said nothing, but she could see his mind working, could see him trying to calculate the probability that such a shelter could sustain human life through an Idaho winter, and she did not explain herself to him because her father had taught her that some people could understand these things only through the learning of experience, and all other explanation was merely the wind blowing across stone. On her final trip into Galena for supplies, Thea took the sled and walked down the mountain in the early darkness of late November, and the town seemed to have changed in the weeks since she had left it, as though her departure had somehow altered its essential nature, made it seem smaller and more temporary than it had before, and the miners were mostly gone now, having shifted to other claims or other territories as the season turned, and the boarding houses stood mostly empty, and the general store was running minimal stock. Mrs. Polly Fenton was there behind the counter, a ruddy-faced woman who trafficked in gossip the way other merchants trafficked in salt and flour, and when she saw Thea, her eyes went wide, and she said something about an igloo, about the Swedish woman and her igloo on the hillside, and she laughed, a sound that was meant to be humorous, but that fell short of that mark, and she said the woman wouldn't last until January, that the thing would collapse under its own weight or melt when the sun came in spring, that it was the act of a desperate woman, and Thea said nothing to any of this, because there was nothing to say to women who measured the world according to what they knew and were incapable of imagining what lay beyond the boundary of their comprehension. She loaded her supplies and paid with the coins from her trading and from the few dollars that remained from her husband's final pay, and she walked back up into the mountains as the snow began to fall again, the kind of snow that comes steadily and without drama, the kind of snow that knew it had all winter to work with, and she did not think about what Mrs. Fenton had said, because thinking about such things was a waste of the mental energy that she would need for the real work ahead, the work of survival and endurance and the 1,000 small adjustments that stood between life and death. In early December, Cleet Harmon came to the snow tunnel, and his arrival was something that she had been expecting without being able to articulate why, as though some part of her had always known that the world would not allow them to exist in peace, that there were predators in all seasons and all places, and that a woman and a boy alone in the mountains were prey, whether they understood themselves that way or not. He came in the afternoon, riding a rangy horse that looked underfed and mean, and he dismounted with the loose-limbed grace of a man who had lived his life in saddles and had never properly stood on solid ground, and he was thin in a way that suggested deprivation rather than discipline, and his face was sharp-featured and scarred, with the kind of eyes that never seemed to look directly at anything but somehow saw everything, and he wore a dirty sheepskin coat and a hat that had been beaver once, but had faded to the color of old bone. He did not approach the entrance to the snow tunnel but circled it, studying the structure with an intensity that suggested he was measuring it against some internal calculation, and when he finally turned to face Thea, who had emerged from the tunnel entrance, he smiled in a way that was not pleasant, and said he had filed a mining claim on this hillside, that there were rumors of silver deposits beneath the snow and the soil, that she would need to move on because her squatter's claim, if she had filed one, would not hold water against a valid mining patent. Thea said nothing, and Emil emerged from behind his mother and pressed against her legs. And Harmon looked at the boy without expression and then back at the snow tunnel, and he laughed, a sound like dry wood breaking. And he said the structure would melt in the spring and she would have nothing, that he had seen snow shelters before, and they were temporary things, fit for savages and people without the sense to build proper structures. And he told her to clear off within a week, or he would come back with people who would help her move. And he rode away without waiting for a response. And Thea watched him go down the trail and disappear into the lower timber. And she felt Emil's small hand gripping her skirt, and she placed her own hand on his head and said nothing, because there were no words that could adequately address what had just occurred. No language that could encompass the casual cruelty of a man who would threaten someone's home without understanding the cost of that home. The years of accumulated knowledge and skill that had gone into its construction, the desperation and the courage that had made it possible. That night, inside the snow tunnel, with Emil asleep on his platform of furs, his breathing soft and even, and the sound of the living world in a state of peace, Thea sat by the hearth in the cooking alcove and took out the curved snow knife, the knife that her father had carried for 60 years. And she began to sharpen it against a stone that she had brought from the creek, and the sound was a soft metallic whisper that barely disturbed the silence. And she thought of the storm that was coming, the great storm that was always coming in the mountains when winter was young, the storm that would bury the valleys and erase the trails and make the world a place where only the prepared could survive. And she knew that Cleet Harmon would not return while that storm was falling. And she knew that when he did return, when the snow settled and the paths became passable again, she would be waiting, and the knife would be sharp, and the shelter she had built would be warmer than any place he had ever known. And he would see then that he had been wrong about what it meant to live in snow, about what was permanent and what was temporary, about the difference between shelter built from desperation and shelter built from knowledge that descended from ancestors who had lived in this white world for longer than history had words to describe. The blizzard came 3 days later, and it came not as a singular storm, but as an enormous white wall that moved across the Sawtooth Valley like a living thing, erasing the sky and the earth and the very boundary between them, so that the world became one undifferentiated, vast and terrible storm. And Thea knew it the moment she woke before dawn and heard the sound of the wind above the snow tunnel, that peculiar keening that spoke of snow being driven horizontally at a speed that would strip the skin from an unprotected face in minutes. And she rose quietly so as not to wake Emil and went to the cooking alcove where the hearth still held coals from the night, and she built the fire up carefully, adding dry pine boughs and then a piece of split spruce until the flames threw their yellow light on the white walls and the thin tin chimney pipe, and she could see her breath again for the first time in weeks. And she knew with absolute certainty that the snow tunnel would hold, that it would do more than hold, that it would embrace them and keep them and fold them into its ancient knowledge, the way her father's hands had taught her before she was old enough to remember learning it at all, the way his father before him had learned it from the mountains of northern Sweden, where a human life meant understanding snow the way other people understood air or water. For the first 2 days of the blizzard, the snow deepened outside with a relentlessness that seemed almost personal, as if the storm had singled out this particular hillside for a trial of severity, and she could hear it above the tunnel ceiling, a sound like something alive and breathing. A vast, inhuman respiration that shook the walls but did not penetrate them, and she did not go outside, did not need to, had provision for exactly this moment, with the precision of someone who had learned that the difference between comfort and death might come down to the placement of a bundle of pine needle tea or the careful hoarding of a sack of flour, and she moved through the tunnel chambers in a kind of sacred routine, checking the hearth, adjusting the tin pipe so that the smoke rose clear, and the toxic fumes that gathered in improperly ventilated snow chambers did not accumulate, bringing fresh snow from the entrance tunnel to melt in a bronze pot for drinking water, checking the stored food, counting the dried elk jerky, examining the jars of rendered fat, ensuring that the honey was still sealed in its tin, and all the while teaching Emil the things that her father had taught her, and that his father before him had taught him, moving the boy's small hands over the snow walls to feel the density and structure, showing him how to read the crystal pattern in the blue-white glow that came through the snow ceiling when the sun was visible above the clouds, explaining in Swedish and in English, both that the snow itself was a living teacher if one knew how to listen, that it could tell you through its texture and its resistance, whether you had packed it correctly, whether the chamber would hold, whether the walls would weep water in spring or remain solid. And as the blizzard deepened and the walls became thicker with fresh accumulation, the temperature inside the chambers began to rise with a steadiness that seemed miraculous, so that by the third day the sleeping platform was so warm that she removed 2 blankets, and Emil wore only a wool shirt and breeches, and no longer asked why they were warm when the world outside was dying of cold. And she realized with a kind of awe that the storm itself was insulating them, that the harder the wind blew and the deeper the snow fell, the more secure their shelter became, as if the very forces that would destroy other men and women and children were conspiring to protect her and her boy. And she thought of Cleet Harmon in that moment, and wondered what had become of him, wondered whether he had found shelter in the town, or whether he was still seeking it, and felt a strange pull in her chest that was neither mercy nor its absence, but something more complicated, something closer to the truth that survival itself was a kind of judgment that required no executioner, that asked only whether one had learned the old knowledge or turned away from it, whether one had built in stone and timber or in snow. Inside the snow tunnel, time moved differently than it did in the world of normal seasonal progression, and days became less important than the small hours of work that filled them. She had begun carving a new alcove in the storage chamber, a space where additional stores could be kept safe from any small animals that might find their way inside despite the depth and the cold. And she worked at night when Emil slept, worked with a dedication that bordered on obsession, using her curved snow knife to cut through the packed wall, with a motion that was part carving and part dancing, a motion that her father's father had perfected in the high mountains north of the Arctic Circle, where the snow was measured in meters, and whole families and whole extended kin groups lived for months in chambers cut from mountainsides, living and dying inside the white walls, their lives measured not in years, but in winters survived. And with each pass of the knife, she felt herself connected to a long chain of women and men, stretching back across centuries, all of them cutting their lives into snow, all of them learning that the earth would provide shelter if one only understood its language, if one only approached it with respect and patience and the accumulated knowledge that could not be found in any book but only in the hands and the memory. When she had finished the alcove, she lined its back wall with spruce boughs to insulate it and to freshen the air with their scent, and arranged her stores there with the precision of someone arranging icons in a chapel. The smoked elk jerky wrapped in cloth in one niche, the flour sack in another, the tins of rendered fat and honey in a third, arranged so that the honey was highest and the fat lower. The things most precious kept where hands could reach them easily. Jars of pine needle tea dried and bundled with twine, dried berries wrapped in cloth and sealed tight, and above it all, a small wooden figure that Emil had carved, a moose, crude but recognizable, with something like nobility in its stance, which he had placed there one morning when she was not watching. And when she found it, she wept without knowing why, and left it there as an offering to whatever spirits might be listening inside the white walls, whatever ancient presences inhabited the snow and the mountain. By the 5th day of the blizzard, the snow outside had piled so deep that the entrance tunnel was nearly sealed, compressed by the weight of what was falling above it, and she had to widen it each morning, cutting back the drifts with her snow shovel, working with her face turned away from the wind that still came screaming down the mountain. And it was on the morning of the 5th day that she heard a sound that made her stop mid-motion, a sound that was almost human, but might have been the wind playing tricks through some crevasse in the accumulated drifts, might have been her imagination producing phantom voices from the roar of the blizzard. And she called into the darkness of the entrance tunnel and heard nothing in return for a long moment. And then, as she was turning to go back inside, she saw movement, a figure emerging from the white depths like something being born from the storm itself. And it was a woman, half buried in snow, with something dark bundled against her chest. And Thea did not hesitate, but moved forward and caught the woman as she collapsed, and she saw that it was Martha Peterson, the young wife of one of the mine workers, whom she had seen once in Galena when she had come to trade for supplies, and the bundle was her infant son, wrapped in what had been a blanket, but was now frozen solid to the shape of a body, and Martha's face was blue with cold, and her eyes had that terrible clarity that comes just before freezing takes the mind and erases the person. And Thea brought her inside into the sleeping chamber and wrapped her and the baby in every fur and blanket they possessed and gave her broth made from smoked bones and fat, hot enough to cause pain as it thawed the muscles of her mouth and throat. And Martha wept and said that she had followed the smoke from the chimney pipe, that she had left the town because the mining company building where the families were sheltering had begun to collapse, that snow had poured in through a broken wall and the miners had been unable to shore it up, that the roof was sagging and the snow kept falling, and she had heard the sound of timber cracking, and she had taken her son and walked out into the blizzard because dying in motion seemed preferable to dying under falling wood and snow. She said that she had walked uphill seeking higher ground and found smoke rising from the white mountain and followed it like a star, followed it through drifts that came to her waist and then to her chest, and then the snow had taken her consciousness, and she thought she and her boy were going to die, that she would simply lie down and sleep and never wake. And Thea held her and said nothing, for what was there to say? And that night she cut another chamber in the tunnel wall, working rapidly with a kind of furious energy, her hands moving with precision that seemed to come not from her conscious mind, but from some older knowledge that lived in her muscles and her blood, that lived in the very cells of her body, carrying the memory of her father and his father before him. And by morning she had created a second sleeping room with a floor of pine boughs and a stack of furs arranged for maximum insulation, and Martha and her infant son were warm for the first time since the blizzard had begun, and the baby, who had not made a sound or any movement suggesting life, began to cry. But Martha had not come alone, though she did not know it, for her departure from Galena had been witnessed by others who had been watching the snowfall and wondering who among them might attempt to find other shelter. And on the next morning, 3 more figures emerged from the snow. Thomas McKay, one of the senior miners, with his wife and 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 6, who said they had been observing where Martha went and had followed her trail before the snow covered it entirely, had followed it step by step, and that the town was collapsing around them. The mine office had caved in, the assay building was half buried, and families were being crushed under the weight of accumulated snow and the failure of mortar and timber to hold against the relentless pressure from above, that people were injured and dying, and the mining company had abandoned them, had no shelter left to offer, and Thea took them in as she had taken in Martha and her son, gave them broth and wrapped them in furs, and that night she cut another chamber, working with an efficiency that seemed born of necessity, and the next day brought more. Mrs. Henrik Larson with her 3 children, who had heard from other miners that someone had found shelter higher up the mountain, and old Mr. Gustav Anderson, who was a miner in name, but who had worked in the north of his own country before the mining, and who, upon entering the snow chambers and seeing their construction and seeing Thea herself, standing there in her wool dress with her platinum braid wound around her head like a crown, and her ice-blue eyes holding something ancient and powerful, fell to his knees and wept, saying in Norwegian that he had not seen work like this since his grandfather had built snow shelters in the mountains near the Arctic, and that he had come to a new world and thought such knowledge lost, thought that what the old people knew would die with them in the cold, and here was a woman keeping the old ways alive, and Thea helped him to his feet and gave him a place by the hearth, and more kept coming. The foreman's wife and her daughter, 2 families with children who had lost their homes, a young man who had been buried under part of the mine structure and dug out by his fellows, but who was injured and could not make it into town. And each time Thea cut new chambers, and each time she drew upon reserves of energy that seemed inexhaustible, working through the nights while the children slept, carve in the snow, move in the accumulated blocks to strengthen the outer walls, creating alcoves for stores and places for people to sleep, and the snow tunnel homestead became not a single family's shelter, but a refuge, a sanctuary carved into the mountain, a place where the earth itself had been shaped by human hands into a sanctuary, and the blizzard continued to fall with an intensity that seemed beyond nature, adding thickness to the walls with each passing day, and the interior temperature remained constant throughout, the sleeping chambers holding their warmth like a living thing, the cooking alcove with its stone hearth and tin pipe maintaining a warmth that allowed water to boil for tea and for washing, the main chamber staying above freezing, and all of it insulated by the massive snow walls that grew thicker and thicker as the storm raged, as if the blizzard itself were conspiring to perfect the shelter, to make it more and more secure with each increment of accumulation, turning what should have been a death sentence into an embrace. And then, on the 8th morning of the blizzard, when the snow had reached nearly 12 feet in depth and the wind had not ceased for even a single hour despite the intermittent gaps that people kept hoping meant the storm was breaking, a sound came from the entrance tunnel, a human voice, calling out, half coherent, words slurred as if the speaker's jaw was frozen, and Thea went to see, though part of her already knew what she would find. And there, in the entrance tunnel, collapsed against one wall, his face bleeding, and his left leg bent at an angle that suggested a break of some severity, was Cleet Harmon. His sheepskin coat was torn in a dozen places, and the filling was exposed to the cold. His Colt revolver was gone, lost to the storm or lost when whatever structure had sheltered him came down, and his hat was gone, and there was a gash on his forehead that had frozen blood dark across his brow like a mark, and his eyes seemed unable to focus, seemed to see something beyond the present moment. And he looked up at Thea with eyes that held no recognition and no malice, but only a kind of terrible need. The need of something dying that sees a light in the darkness and crawls toward it with whatever strength remains, whether that light be salvation or damnation. And Thea stood there and looked at him, this man who had filed fraudulent claims against her land, this man who had confronted her with accusations and venality, this man who represented everything that was predatory in the world of men and the way they moved through the world, taking what was not theirs. And she looked at him and felt nothing, felt less than nothing, felt a kind of terrible clarity that moved beyond judgment into something closer to acceptance. And she stepped aside from the entrance to the main chamber and gestured with her hand for him to come inside, and he crawled toward her, his injured leg dragging useless behind him, leaving a thin trail of blood on the snow, and she helped him to the alcove by the hearth where old Mr. Anderson had been sitting, and Anderson moved without a word, rose and stepped away, his eyes meeting Thea's for a moment in a look of complete understanding, and Thea gave Harmon broth and wrapped his leg as best she could after cutting away his pant leg and examining the break, which was not clean but which was not through the skin, and she set it using pine branches and cloth strips, working with the same methodical precision she would have brought to strengthening a snow wall, and gave him a blanket. And he did not speak, could not speak, his jaw working silently, his eyes gradually closing as the warmth of the chamber and the exhaustion of survival took him into sleep. And she left him there by the warmth and returned to her work, because there were still people sheltering in her snow chambers and the blizzard was still falling and there was no time for anything but the small, crucial acts of survival. The storm broke on the morning of the 9th day, with a sudden and complete silence that was almost more shocking than the roar that had preceded it. And the silence that followed the wind was so absolute that people woke believing themselves dead, believing that perhaps they had died in the night. And this white silence was what came after. But they were not dead. They were alive in chambers of snow at the base of a north-facing hillside in Idaho territory. Alive because a woman and her son and her father's knowledge had sheltered them through the worst trial that the winter could inflict. And when people began to emerge from the snow tunnel entrance, carefully, because the snow above the tunnel was still unstable, still settling, and see the landscape around them, they understood what they had witnessed, what they had survived, and saw that the entire valley was buried under nearly 8 feet of new snow. The town of Galena, visible only as a series of mounds and geometric shapes beneath the drifts, the peaks of chimneys rising like monuments to houses that no longer existed as shelter, the mining company buildings partially buried or collapsed, and the cabins that had sheltered the miners' families, now nothing but massive drifts, beneath which wood and canvas and lives had been broken and crushed. They understood that they had been saved by something that none of them had believed in, saved by the old knowledge, saved by a woman with ice-blue eyes and a platinum braid who had learned from her father and carried that learning across an ocean to a new world, and they looked at her with the particular reverence that those who have been given their lives back often feel for the one who held the key to that survival. And in the days that followed, as rescues were organized and families reunited and the damage assessed and bodies were found and retrieved, Thea and Emil remained in the snow tunnel homestead, and additional chambers were carved by volunteers who understood now what Thea had understood all along, and additional people sheltered in the tunnels, as more families were discovered half buried in the ruins of their homes. And she continued to teach Emil the old ways, the carving technique, the understanding of snow as material and shelter, the words in Swedish and Sami for the different types of snow, the wet snow, the wind-packed snow, the old snow, the dangerous snow that could slide or collapse, the techniques for packing and reinforcing walls using the specific pressure of the hands, the methods for moving heat through chambers using carefully positioned hearths and carefully controlled airflow. Understanding that ventilation in a snow structure was the difference between comfort and death. And Emil learned with the seriousness of a child who understands that what he is learning might one day mean the difference between survival and death, might one day allow him to shelter others as his mother had sheltered them. And he learned his father's name and the story of his father's death. And he learned that grief and gratitude were not opposites, but could exist in the same heart, in the same moment, the way snow could be both beautiful and deadly. And when Cleet Harmon was well enough to speak, weeks after the blizzard had ended and his leg had begun to heal under Thea's careful attention, he said that his shack on the edge of town had collapsed under the snow load and that miners from the company had dug him out half-crushed beneath the remains of his roof, and that he had tried to reach the mining company building where shelter had been organized, but the path had become impassable, had become a maze of drifts and exposed debris that seemed designed by malevolent spirits to confuse and turn back anyone seeking passage, and he had wandered in the blizzard until he saw the light of a lantern in the snow above the entrance to the tunnel, and had followed it like the star that Martha Peterson had followed, like a beacon cast out by something more than human intention. And Thea listened to this and said nothing, for what was there to say? And when the blizzard season ended, and the spring came with a rush of water and the sound of life returning to the land, and the snow began in earnest to melt, the massive drifts collapsing into rivers that ran down the mountainside, Harmon walked away from the Sawtooth Valley, limping on his healed but weakened leg, leaning on a crutch that Thea had carved from a fallen pine branch, and no one in Galena ever saw him again, though old Mr. Gustav Anderson, whose name turned out to be truly Gustav Anderson, and not just an anglicized version, who turned out to be a retired assayer with connections to the Territorial Land Office in Boise, and a reputation for honesty that had not been diminished by the decades he had spent working in mines, had taken the trouble to report Harmon's fraudulent mining claim to the proper authorities, and by the time Harmon was gone, his papers had been examined by men who understood the forging of claims documents and found to be forgeries, and a note had been sent to the territorial marshal, and if Harmon had stayed, it would have gone badly for him indeed. But he did not stay, and perhaps he understood that a man who had been judged and found wanting by the mercy of a woman has no place in the country that surrounds that woman's home, that some kinds of judgment cannot be appealed, and some kinds of mercy are more terrible than any punishment administered by law. And then, 3 weeks after the blizzard ended, when the snow had begun in earnest to melt, and the first green shoots appeared on the southern slopes, and the sound of water running over rock filled the valleys, replacing the sound of wind that had dominated the winter months. A wagon came up the mountain road to the Sawtooth Valley, driven by a man that Thea did not know, but who bore himself with the patient competence of someone accustomed to moving through difficult terrain. And in the wagon bed sat two people who were strangers to the land, but not strangers to Thea. And she saw the woman first, and her heart stopped and then began again with a force that nearly knocked her to her knees, for it was her sister Astrid, and beside her was Astrid's husband Henrik, whom she had never met but who she recognized from letters, and they had come from Minnesota because they had received a letter that Thea had written months before, a letter written before Lars had died, when he was still alive and she was still hoping that he might recover, that the winter might pass and the spring would bring healing. And in that letter, she had asked them to come west, had asked them to help her build something in a new land, and they had set out before the winter had closed the passes, and they had made their way slowly from St. Paul and had wintered in Denver and had searched the mining camps from there, searching for a woman with a platinum braid and a Swedish accent and ice blue eyes, searching for their sister whom they had not seen since she had boarded a ship in Gothenburg 5 years before, searching for their sister, and they had found her at last in a snow shelter at the base of a north-facing hillside, standing in the spring sunlight with her son Emil beside her, and Astrid looked at the carved snow chamber entrance and the tunnel construction and the careful pattern of the walls, and she put her hand to her mouth and said, "Father's work." And Thea said, "Yes." And the sisters embraced in a way that required no words, that required nothing but the simple fact of recognition and reunion, the knowledge that something sent across the years and across the ocean had found its way home. Henrik unloaded the wagon and showed them the tools he had brought: a good saw with a sharp blade, a pair of axes with heads of good iron, a box of nails, a leather pouch of screws, and a bag of precious seeds from Minnesota, seeds that Henrik's own father had saved, seeds for wheat and beans and root vegetables, and another leather pouch that he opened to show them a sum of money that would have seemed impossible to Thea 2 months before, but which now seemed merely practical. And he explained with the calm of someone accustomed to such transactions that they had filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office to purchase the hillside as a legal homestead, that the money would cover the filing fees and the purchase price, and that the hill was now legally Thea's, no longer open to claim jumpers or men with fraudulent papers, now protected by law as well as by the snow and the work of her hands. And Astrid added that they had come to help her build a proper cabin, a cabin with windows that could look out onto the valley, a cabin with a wooden door and a real bed frame, though she gestured to the snow tunnel entrance and said that the old way should not be forgotten, that every winter the snow shelter should be rebuilt and maintained, and that this combination of the new world and the old knowledge would be the inheritance that they would pass to Emil and to any children that might come after him. And that summer, while the snow melted into nothing but the memory of itself, and the meadows exploded with wildflowers, and the aspens shimmered with new leaves that turned the mountainside into something that seemed painted rather than natural, Thea and Astrid and Henrik built a cabin on the southern face of the hillside, built it with good timber and with care, building in the old Swedish way that their father had taught them, and the cabin had glass windows and a wooden door and a real bed frame and furniture made by human hands rather than carved from snow. But behind and beside the cabin, On the north-facing slope where the snow piled deepest in winter, Thea began the work of creating a new snow shelter chamber, and each winter thereafter, as the snows fell and the world became white again, and the temperature dropped, and the survivors of the great blizzard thought of the tunnels, and remembered Thea and later Emil, helped by Henrik and Astrid, and eventually by other people who learned the technique, would cut the new chambers and shape them and furnish them with stores and furs, and the snow tunnel homestead became an institution, a known shelter, a place where people in distress could come in the deep winter and find refuge and warmth and food, and it became known throughout the valley not as a death trap, but as a place of salvation, and it became known to people far beyond the valley, and stories were told about it in other mining camps, stories that grew in the telling, but that contained a kernel of truth. And old Mr. Gustav Anderson, who had wept when he first saw Thea's work, settled on land 2 valleys over and brought others with him, men and women from the north of Europe, who understood the old ways, who had grown up in snow and cold, who had learned from their fathers and mothers and grandparents how to live in the deep winter without fear. And gradually, the Sawtooth Valley became a settlement not of gamblers and drifters and claim jumpers and men seeking quick wealth, but of farmers and herders and people who had brought their knowledge of the cold north with them and who planted crops and raised animals and who built their own shelters, some of snow in the winter, some of timber and stone, a community of people bound together by the knowledge that survival required respect for the earth and for the traditions that had allowed humans to survive in the harshest climates that the world possessed. And Emil grew to manhood in this valley, learning both the ways of the timber cabin and the ways of the snow shelter, learning to read the winter as his mother had taught him, learning the patience and the precision that snowcraft required, learning to see the old ways not as something primitive and backward, but as something profound and beautiful. And when he was grown, he took a wife and had children of his own, and he taught them as his mother had taught him, teaching them the Swedish words and the Sami traditions, teaching them to carve with respect. And by the time that Emil's own children were having children, the snow shelter techniques that Thea had carried across the Atlantic in her hands, and her memory had become woven into the very fabric of the valley, had become a tradition that belonged not just to one woman or one family, but to an entire community of people who had chosen to make their home in a place that most would have thought uninhabitable, but which had revealed itself to be not a place of death, but a place of profound and terrible life, a place where knowledge mattered and skill mattered, and where the past and the present could be held together in balance. And many years after the great blizzard, when Thea's platinum braid had become threaded through with silver and her hands had become lined with age, but had never lost their knowledge of the snow, their ability to read the structure of ice and to shape it with a curved knife, she stood with her sister Astrid on the hillside and looked down at the valley below, at the cabins and the shelters, at the gardens and the fields where crops grew in summer, at the snow tunnels carved into the northern slopes each winter, at the smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. And she thought of her father, and of his father before him, of all the people who had learned to make homes in the northern snow, of all the knowledge that had passed down through hands and memory. And she understood that she had not merely survived, but that she had carried something precious across half a world and had planted it in new ground and had watched it grow and flourish, and that this was not a small thing, was not the kind of thing that appeared in newspapers or was recorded in the histories that important men wrote, but was something deeper and older and more true than any of those records could capture. And she knew that she had been tested by the blizzard and had been found equal to the test, and that her son had learned from her what she had learned from her father, and that the knowledge would continue, would flow forward into the future like water moving downhill, would shape the lives of people not yet born, would prove again and again in the long winters that came. After that, a human being could take the most hostile element and remake it into shelter and home and family and hope, and that the snow itself, so terrible and so beautiful, so deadly and so sustaining, was not the enemy but the teacher, and that if one listened to its lessons with patience and respect and the accumulated wisdom of generations, the snow would provide everything that was needed to survive and to thrive and to build a life that was worth living in a place that was worth calling home.